I'm Mary Alice Shepard. I was born Mary Alice Carey Shepard after marriage. And I'm talking with you this evening about the years that we spent, and I say we because Fred Shepard, my husband, and I went together to the Middle East as appointees of United Church Board for World Ministries. And we were in what was called the Near East section, which included Turkey, but our first years were spent in Syria for 10 years. Then we were moved over to Turkey, where we served several of the mission schools, but there was work also in Greece and in Lebanon. So it was a fairly wide area. My work was mostly teaching English. My husband was an academic also. He was a biologist and school administrator. So we were always in the school setting, either as school people or in the mission office in Istanbul, which was also very much involved with the schools, as well as the other kind of work that the mission was doing. And for me, most of my teaching was of an English, beginning English, which interested me very much because I had done some studies in early child education and also taught my own children in English at home in the afternoons. They went to the local schools in the mornings. When we lived in Syria, they studied Arabic. And when we lived in Turkey, for 1 year in Talas, 3 of my children studied with the boys in this Talas school. The other child was at boarding school. Now, people say, how did you decide to go overseas and study, and not study, but teach in other countries? Well, we were both brought up, I'm talking about my husband and I, we were brought up in overseas families. My husband was brought up in Turkey. His parents were missionaries, his father a doctor, his grandfather a doctor. I was brought up in Japan. My father a minister, his father a minister. So we knew what it was to be overseas, but we felt we didn't really know our own culture very well. And it was important for us to live and work in the United States when we first got married. So we were both teachers. So we applied to public schools, and we went to Southern Oregon to a very small community and taught in the school there. In Phoenix, Oregon, population 456. And we added 2 more to the population of that little community. And we had 6 very interesting years there, very good years. And we expanded our family to include 3 children. And then we got the itch to go back and live in another country and serve people that we would like to teach with and also to. So we applied to 2 or 3 organizations. And with 3 children, you don't go for a 1-year term to any one place. We felt it wasn't fair to the kids to jump around too much. And the most interesting offer and heartfelt offer came from the United Church of Christ. And they really wanted us to go to teach. At that time, there was an opening in Syria at what's Aleppo College. Now, the interesting thing about Aleppo College was that it really started in Turkey. It started in Antep, Turkey. It was Central Turkey College, which moved and combined with a Presbyterian school and formed a new school called Aleppo College. So we moved there with 3 little children, and of course it was wonderful because the children picked up Arabic right away, and they were teaching us words that we hadn't learned yet in our lessons. And they went to the schools there in the mornings and studied Arabic, and then in the afternoons we had English language lessons and at home, and I was their teacher. That went for 10 years. It was a very, very tense 10 years. And there were, I seem to remember, 11 coups d'etat in 10 years. And there were times when we had to keep the family and the children at home. But they were much more fortunate than the youngsters who lived in the town. We lived on a campus. When they could go outdoors, they could run and play outdoors. But their school friends who were in the community schools down in the city, they had to stay inside their apartments. They couldn't run out and play on a campus. So our children were very privileged in having that special freedom when we were allowed to go outdoors. But we managed to survive those tense years too. And then we were transferred to Turkey. There were openings in Turkey, and they were desperate for help at the schools in Turkey. So we moved at that time to Turkey, and then by this time we'd been 10 years in Syria, so 54 to 64, and it was in the early mid-60s that we moved to Turkey. Our first assignment was in Talas, where we taught for a year, and I had a lot of fun teaching boys. I had been teaching girls, and it was an interesting change to teach the boys and to be called madam. And of course they call the men teachers sir, but I was madam, and I've never since been called madam, but it was an interesting experience. Somebody asked me, how did you decide to go to Turkey? Well, it was an interesting thing. And it's certainly the first decision was not to go to Turkey, it was to go to Syria. But anyway, how did we decide to do this teaching overseas, having settled into a little community in America and being very happy? They were very interested in having overseas American teachers come. And it was a time when America was looking inward, and we were concerned. And for us, it was not difficult to decide to go. In fact, we were almost embarrassed at how easy it was. But we had to be careful because we were taking 3 children. We couldn't just go for 1 year at a time. We had to really think of it in terms of a career. So it was a serious decision. And we found that we became very closely bonded with the faculty. They're mixed faculty, of course. It was foreigners, Americans, mostly some British, but in Turkey it was Turkish folk. In Syria it was Syrians, and we were drawn into their home life, and such wonderful hospitality and interest in us, so that we felt really warmly welcomed. And of course the people there were so family oriented that they couldn't understand how we could live without our parents and the uncles and the aunts and the grandparents to come and play with the children. And how could we do that? It was hard for our Turkish and our Syrian friends, I think, to accept or understand. It was so different from their way of raising little children. But we had many good friends who took an interest in us, and then of course as the children grew older, they went to school with the friends that they made in the kindergarten. They went on up in the grades with them, studied Arabic. They spoke much more fluent Arabic than I, and you could write it. They could write it faster. I was embarrassed. There were very rocky times during those years when we were with our little family. The Suez Crisis in 1967 was a time, in fact, we had to leave we were told by the American Embassy, women and children had to leave, and they called us non-essentials. Now, have you ever been called a non-essential? It's a humiliating experience to be non-essential, but I was a non-essential, as were my children. And so we were taken across the line over to Gaziantep. And we had 3 months living at the hospital there as refugees before we were allowed to go back by our embassy. So there was a little bit of that tension. And then in '74, of course, there was a Cyprus peace mission, and that was a tense time too. So we did experience some of these upheavals in the political sphere that touched our personal lives also, as well as our hearts. My work was often, although I was a teacher and qualified to teach, I worked in the book rooms in every school we went to, counting the textbooks, stamping them, checking them out to students. And the people I asked to help me, the students, were scholarship students. So that was really fun to have that particular kind of relationship with them. In addition to their being my students in a classroom, we were working together in the book room. And they seemed to enjoy that too. It was a little different from the usual activities during the school year. There was a great deal of fine faculty rapport. Of course, we had problems. We all have problems. I mean, life is not without problems. But there was a strong sense of faculty cooperation and concern for each other and each other's problems and health and so forth. It was a very loving kind of a faculty community that we had in each of the schools that we were in. And it was very choice. And I still keep in touch with a number of my former colleagues on the Izmir faculty and on the Üsküdar faculty. And we correspond. And since retiring to this country, my husband Fred and I led 3 different tours to Turkey, and introduced people to the schools and to the work of Altan Ünver, for instance, near Ankara. And those were wonderful tours because they were not just tours in terms of visiting the historic sites of the country, but the people and the kind of work we did, and where we visited those institutions, we were warmly welcomed, and I think that really impressed the people on our tour. The camaraderie that was displayed and the cordiality of the welcome they received because they came with us to visit that campus. Someone asked me if any of the former students and colleagues visit here. I live in what's considered rural Tennessee, and not very many people come to this part of Tennessee, or the part of the country, actually. But we had a couple of people who came through, and that was very nice, Turkish friends from those teaching days.